I never thought I would spend New Year's Eve alone. For me, it had always been a holiday of noise, laughter, friends, and endless toasts. But this year, everything turned out differently. My friends had scattered, my family decided to celebrate in another city, and I stayed here, in the old house I inherited from my uncle. It suited me. Or rather, I convinced myself it did. The weather outside only emphasized my solitude. A snowstorm twisted the snow in a wild dance, and trees bent under the weight of the icy wind. In the living room, the fireplace crackled softly, and I sat in an armchair, wrapped in a warm blanket, holding a glass of wine. I forced myself to turn on a festive program on TV, but it felt utterly out of place. Laughter, jokes, joy, it all clashed with my mood. The clock read 10:47 p.m. when I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought I imagined it. Who would even come out in such weather? But the knock came again, this time more insistent. I got up from the chair, nearly spilling my wine, and went to the door. I looked through the peephole, empty. Yet I was sure I had heard knocking. Carefully, I opened the door, letting out a puff of warm air, and peered into the darkness. No one. Only the wind howled among the bare branches, and snow blanketed everything in a white shroud. Then I noticed it. On the doorstep lay an old black rotary phone. I stared at it, trying to understand where it had come from. The phone looked like a relic from the last century, a scratched body, slightly peeling paint. Someone had left it? But why? I looked around again but saw no one. The cold seeped through my pajamas, so I grabbed the phone and went back inside, closing the door tightly behind me. The phone was heavy, seemingly non-functional. I placed it on the table and examined it for a long time, trying to find any logical explanation. Maybe the neighbors decided to get rid of some old junk? But why in such a strange way, leaving it right at my door? The clock struck 11 p.m. when the phone suddenly rang. The loud, sharp sound shattered the silence, and I froze in place. My heart raced, and I couldn't believe my eyes. The phone, which wasn't plugged into any outlet, was ringing. I hesitated to pick up the receiver. Part of me wanted to throw the phone outside and forget about it. But curiosity won. I cautiously lifted the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" My voice broke into a whisper. At first, there was silence. Only a faint crackling, like from an old radio. Then I heard it. A voice. Hoarse, quiet, as if someone was speaking from the other end of an empty tunnel. "Time is almost up. Do you remember what you did last New Year's Eve?" I froze. My breath caught, and for a few seconds, I couldn't say a word. Who was this? What kind of question was that? But the worst part, I really didn't want to think about last New Year's Eve. "Who is this?" I finally asked. But all I heard in response was a brief, sharp tone. The line went dead. I lowered the receiver, feeling sweat bead on my forehead despite the chill in the room. The phone was silent, but its ring still echoed in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was some strange prank. Maybe a friend trying to be funny. But something about the voice made me doubt that. I returned to the armchair, trying to calm down. But relaxing was impossible. The question from the call replayed in my head like a cursed mantra. "Do you remember what you did last New Year's Eve?" I sat in the chair, but there was no peace. Everything inside me screamed that I should just throw the phone away and forget about it. But I couldn't. It sat on the table, silent, yet its presence seemed to fill the room, as if it were alive. The ringing I heard, and the voice. It couldn't have been real. My thoughts drifted to the past. I tried to remember last New Year's Eve, but my mind was blank. All I could recall was a loud party at a friend's house, lots of alcohol, and an argument with Liam. Yes, we argued, that much was clear. But what happened next? My memory blurred like a poorly developed photograph. I decided to keep myself busy to avoid going mad. I turned back to the TV, opened another bottle of wine, and tried to immerse myself in some mindless holiday program. But it was pointless. I felt as though someone was watching me. Time dragged painfully slowly. 11:30 p.m. I decided I'd had enough, set the glass down, and picked up the phone. It was heavier than I had expected. I carefully examined it from all sides. Nothing unusual, no inscriptions or markings that might explain where it had come from. I turned it over in my hands, hoping to find some kind of clue, but it was in vain. And then it rang again. This time, I was so startled that I nearly dropped it. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hand trembled as I lifted the receiver. "Who is this?" I yelled into the phone without even a greeting. My voice echoed too loudly in the empty room. Silence again. Just static. I was about to hang up when the voice spoke again. "Look at the backyard." I froze. My mind rebelled. Had I really heard that? It was the same voice, hoarse, quiet, but this time it sounded more insistent. Like a command. "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice dropped to a whisper again. But there was no response, just silence. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence of the house. I set the receiver down, feeling a cold sweat run down my back. The backyard? What nonsense was this? My heart drummed out a rhythm of panic. My mind wrestled with itself. Stay safely inside the house or listen to the voice and go out. Logic said one thing, but something deep within me pushed me to take that step. I grabbed a candle, my flashlight didn't work, and threw on a jacket over my pajamas. Pulling up the hood, I cautiously opened the back door and stepped into the darkness. The snowstorm had subsided, but it was eerily quiet. The kind of silence where I could hear nothing but my breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. I looked around, searching for any sign, but the yard looked as it always did, empty, covered in snow. And then I saw it. Right in the middle of the yard, a dark stain was visible on the snow. It was irregular in shape, as if the snow there had been scorched. I walked closer, and when I was just a few steps away, I noticed something in the center of the mark. Something black and shiny. A photograph. I bent down and picked it up, carefully brushing off the snow. My heart clenched as I saw what it was. The photograph was of me and Liam. Smiling, young, from before the argument. It had been taken a year ago, exactly on New Year's Eve. But how had it gotten here? Who could have left it? And why? I turned my head, and in the distance, beyond the trees, I thought I saw something, a figure. It stood motionless, just a silhouette in the darkness, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. And at that moment, I heard the phone ring again, even though I had left it inside the house. I froze in place. My mind refused to accept what was happening. The phone was ringing, even though I knew for certain I had left it inside the house. And the figure in the distance. I wasn't sure if it was even real. The silhouette was blurry, motionless, but it seemed unnaturally dark, almost absorbing the surrounding light. I wanted to drop the photograph and run back to the house, lock the door, and pretend none of this was happening. But my legs felt glued to the ground. My gaze was fixed on the silhouette standing beyond the trees. I tried to make it out more clearly, but the darkness and snow obscured my view. The phone continued to ring. Its loud, monotonous sound pierced the night. It snapped me out of my trance. I forced myself to tear my gaze away from the figure and move back toward the house. I didn't dare look back to see if the shadow was following me. Inside, it wasn't much better. The phone continued to ring, filling the house with an eerie echo. I rushed to the table where I had left it and grabbed the receiver. "Hello?" I asked, trying not to let my fears show. Silence again. No static, no voice. I could only hear my own breathing. But this time, I wasn't going to wait for the mysterious voice to speak. "Who are you? Why are you calling? What kind of game is this?" I shouted into the phone. And then I heard it. Not words, but something like a sigh, heavy and deep. Then the voice spoke again. "You must pay for what you've done. Come outside again. We're waiting." The receiver fell from my hands. The voice sounded distant, but I was certain it was speaking to me. And its words left no doubt that this was connected to last year's New Year's Eve. "We're waiting." Who were we? I had no answer. I felt cold rising from my toes to the back of my neck, as if fear itself was seeping through my body. I turned back toward the rear door and opened it. The wind hit my face again, but now the outside seemed quieter. The snow had almost stopped, and the night looked even darker and more menacing. Slowly, I stepped into the yard, holding the candle in my hand. The dark stain on the snow where I had found the photograph was still there, but the silhouette beyond the trees was gone. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice sounded unexpectedly loud in the stillness of the night. No answer. Only the faint whisper of wind among the trees. I took a few steps toward the edge of the yard, where the forest began. Something inside me told me not to do this, but I couldn't stop myself. It felt as though something was pulling me forward, deeper into the darkness. And then I saw them. Footprints. They led from the spot where the photograph had been lying straight into the forest. Bare footprints. I lowered the candle closer to the ground to get a better look. The prints were clear, human-sized. But the snow around them looked strange. It seemed to have melted slightly, leaving wet patches behind. I didn't know what to do. Should I follow them? Or just go back to the house, lock myself in, and wait for dawn? But every time I tried to step away, something in my mind whispered, "Go on. You must." My legs moved on their own, following the trail. Step by step, I entered the forest. The darkness around me grew thicker, and even the candlelight seemed insufficient to dispel it. The farther I went, the stronger the feeling became that I wasn't alone. I heard it after I had walked several dozen meters. A faint sound, like someone sighing near my ear. I spun around sharply, raising the candle, but saw nothing. "Who are you?" I asked again, trying to keep my fear in check. "What do you want from me?" There was no reply. Only the wind. And then the candle went out. The darkness closed around me instantly, pressing in from all sides. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I tried to steady my breathing, but the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone became unbearable. My body instinctively leaned back toward the house, but my feet slipped on the snow. I stood there in complete blackness, with only the faint glow of my house's windows far behind me to guide me towards safety. I took a step back, and that's when it happened. A sound. The crunch of snow, faint but loud enough to grab my attention. It came from beyond the trees, as though someone had stepped in the darkness. I froze, holding my breath. The crunch came again, this time closer. "Who's there?" I shouted, desperately trying to keep control of my voice. No answer. I raised my hand, hoping to find the candle in my jacket pocket, but of course, it wasn't there. I must have dropped it when the flame went out. My heart hammered in my chest. The crunching grew louder, slower, and now I was certain it was the sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking toward me. My mind raced, searching for explanations, but none of them felt rational. "I know you're there!" I yelled, hoping to deter whatever was approaching me. And then I heard it. "Do you remember Kevin?" It was the same voice I'd heard on the phone. Hoarse, as if the speaker was gasping for air. But this time, it wasn't coming from the phone. It was here, in the forest, nearby. I turned and ran. My feet slipped on the snow, the cold wind stung my face, but I didn't stop. The light from my house was the only point I could focus on, like a lifeline in the dark. My lungs burned, but fear propelled me forward. When I finally reached the door, I burst inside and slammed it shut. One lock, then another clicked into place, and only then did I let myself breathe. But I knew this wasn't over. I turned around and saw the phone. It was ringing again. "No, no, no," I whispered. But the ringing didn't stop. My body moved almost on its own toward the table, and I picked up the receiver. It was ice cold to the touch, but I couldn't stop myself. "What do you want?" I whispered. "You know what you did," the voice replied. "Tell me, do you remember that night?" I stayed silent. My hands shook. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to remember. The voice grew sharper. "They're looking for you, Kevin. They're all waiting for you to answer for what you've done." "Who are they?" I screamed into the receiver. "What did I do?" The answer came softly but clearly. "Go back to the pond." The words froze me. The pond. Last year. Memories began to surface, in fragments, pieces, but the picture was still incomplete. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a revelation I wasn't ready for. The phone went silent. I dropped the receiver and sank to the floor. My thoughts raced chaotically, but one thing was clear: I couldn't avoid what had started. I would have to remember. Last year, my friends and I celebrated New Year's near the pond. The party was loud, full of laughter and alcohol. But something happened. Liam and I argued. Why? He accused me of something, but what happened next? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the memory to come back, but it was like staring into a thick fog. I lifted my head. The phone was ringing again. The phone rang incessantly, as if demanding my attention. The sound seemed to fill the entire room, penetrating every corner. I sat on the floor, too terrified to even glance at it, but the noise was too loud to ignore. Two emotions warred within me, fear and the desperate need to understand what was happening. Finally, I reached out and picked up the receiver. "What do you want from me?" My voice trembled, unable to conceal my fear any longer. "It's not a matter of what I want," the voice from the phone replied. It was calm, but its coldness sent a shiver through me. "It's a matter of whether you can face the truth." "I don't understand," I shouted. "Who are you? Why is this happening?" "They're coming for you," the voice said, ignoring my questions. "But you still have a chance. Go back to the pond. You'll find your answers there." I fell silent. The pond. Images from the past swirled in my head, but none were clear. All I could remember was arguing with Liam. And then, white noise, nothing. And now this voice was telling me to go back there? Why? I asked in a near whisper. "What will I find?" The voice didn't respond. Instead, I heard the same dial tone, signaling the end of the call. I dropped the receiver as though it had burned me and stumbled away from the phone. But the words still echoed in my mind. "They're coming for you. Go back to the pond." I sank into the chair by the fireplace, trying to collect my thoughts. But the house no longer felt comforting. I felt like a prisoner in a trap. Shadows that had once been ordinary now seemed alive. Every sound, even the crackle of the firewood, made me flinch. Then I heard another sound. It wasn't sharp, but it was impossible to ignore, a faint tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the living room window. I spun around, but I saw nothing. The darkness outside was dense, revealing no movement. Then the tapping came again. I rose from the chair and, holding my breath, approached the window. In the light of the fireplace, I saw faint, blurry marks on the glass. I pressed my hand to the pane, trying to make sense of them, but then a new sound reached my ears. This time, it came from the hallway. A whisper. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakably there. I turned, my eyes fixed on the dark corridor. My heart began to race once more. "Is someone there?" I called out, struggling to keep panic from overtaking me. Deep down, I knew no one would answer. I grabbed the flashlight from beside the fireplace and stepped into the hallway. The beam of light barely pierced the darkness. Each step echoed loudly, and I hardly dared to breathe. The whisper had stopped, but the sense that I wasn't alone only grew stronger. When I reached the end of the corridor, I saw it. On the fogged-up mirror hanging on the wall, words were written. My knees nearly gave out as I read them. "It's time to return. To the pond." Water dripped from the mirror, as if the words had been written by a wet finger. I couldn't comprehend how this was possible, but I knew one thing: if I stayed here, it would only get worse. I returned to the living room, grabbed my coat and flashlight, and without looking back, ran out of the house. The cold night wind bit into my face as I burst out of the house. Darkness enveloped me, and I stood on the porch, clutching the flashlight as though it were my only protection against the unknown. The snow crunched underfoot, and the wooden steps groaned loudly as I descended. I tried to convince myself that all of this was a hallucination. The phone, the voices, the writing on the mirror, it had to be a fabrication of my mind, worn thin by fear and isolation. But staring at the deep, dark footprints in the snow leading across the yard toward the forest, I knew this wasn't something my imagination could conjure. The flashlight beam skimmed over the snow, illuminating the path ahead. The footprints were unmistakable, as if someone had just walked there moments ago. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it's a prank. Maybe the neighbors. Someone's trying to scare me. But deep down, I knew better. I stepped into the forest, following the tracks. The darkness was thicker here, almost tangible. The branches of the trees arched toward me, forming a tunnel through which the flashlight barely penetrated. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the cold seemed to squeeze my lungs tighter with every breath. Then, the sound again. Crunching. Only this time, it wasn't coming from me. I froze in the middle of the forest. The flashlight beam darted around as I turned sharply toward the sound. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice dull in the heavy silence. And then I saw it. A shadow flickered in the light of the flashlight. It was indistinct, but undeniably human. I stepped forward, trying to get a better look, but the shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. My heart thundered, but my legs kept moving forward as if propelled by some unseen force. I continued to follow the tracks until something new appeared. In the middle of the forest, on a patch of snow cleared of its cover, stood what looked like an improvised table. A wooden crate, with objects laid across its top. I approached cautiously, and when the flashlight's beam illuminated the contents, a wave of horror washed over me. On the table lay a soaked jacket. Liam's jacket. I recognized it immediately. Green, with a distinct tear in the sleeve. Liam had always joked that it was his lucky jacket. But now it looked as if it had just been pulled from the water. Drops of water dripped from the fabric, forming a small puddle that was beginning to freeze in the cold air. I stepped back, trying to process what I was seeing. How had this gotten here? Who had brought it? Liam? I called out, not understanding why I was addressing someone who had been missing for a year. And then everything shifted. The crunching sound of snow again. This time, closer. I spun around sharply, and the flashlight illuminated a face. But it wasn't the face I expected. Standing before me was a figure. Tall, dark, almost translucent. Its face was distorted, and its eyes glowed with a pale, dead light. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt parched, frozen with fear. "Do you remember me, Kevin?" the hoarse voice asked. But this time, it wasn't coming from the phone. It was right in front of me. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The silhouette didn't advance, but its presence grew heavier, suffocating. When I realized I couldn't bear to look at it any longer, I turned and ran. My feet slid on the snow, my hands trembling as I clutched the flashlight. I didn't stop. The flashlight beam flickered, lighting only fragments of the path ahead. I ran until I'd burst out of the forest, but the voice pursued me even then. "You can't escape, Kevin. You must go back." I slammed the door of my house behind me, locking it tightly. My mind screamed in terror, but I knew this wasn't over. Whatever this was, it wouldn't stop until I returned to the pond. I leaned against the door, gasping for air. The cold wood pressed against my back, the only thing that felt solid in this terrifying, chaotic reality. My heart still raced from the sprint, and my ears rang with the voice that now haunted me not just in phone calls but in the real world. The creature's words pierced my mind like needles. "You must return. You cannot escape." But what was worse was that I had started to remember. I collapsed into the chair by the fireplace, waves of memories crashing over me. Last New Year's Eve, the party we had organized with friends. Everyone was drunk, laughing, celebrating. But something had gone wrong with Liam. He was my best friend, but as it often happens, alcohol brought out tensions buried deep. We argued. The reason seemed ridiculous now, something I'd said about his girlfriend or his failures. But in the heat of that moment, it didn't matter. We stood by the pond, shouting at each other. I remembered his face. First anger, then disappointment. He yelled that I always thought I was better than him, that I didn't respect him. Then he stepped closer, and I pushed him. It was reflexive, not hard, but enough for him to lose his balance and fall into the water. I stood there stunned. Liam surfaced, struggling to get out, but the ice near the edge cracked, and he went under. I wanted to help, I really did, but something stopped me. Fear. Panic. I turned and ran back to the house, leaving him there, alone, in the freezing water. For the first time, I allowed myself to remember. The voice's words now echoed like a truth I had tried to bury. He had come back for me. But why now? Why this night? The phone rang again, its sharp sound cutting through my thoughts. I flinched, dread flooding me. I didn't want to pick it up, but I knew I had to. My hand reached for the receiver as if it had a will of its own. "Hello?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Now you remember," the voice said. "But this isn't the end. You must return to the pond." "I don't want to," I shouted into the receiver. "It was an accident. I didn't mean for him to die." "It doesn't matter," the voice replied, calm and merciless. "The time for reckoning has come. You must come." The line went silent, but the phone didn't disconnect. The faint hum of the open line remained, and I set the receiver down, the ringing in my head growing louder. I felt incapable of going through with this. But I also knew I had no choice. I walked to the door, put on my jacket, and grabbed the flashlight. Looking back at the house, I realized this might be the last time I saw it. I trudged toward the pond, surrounded by dark trees that seemed to lean toward me, their branches whispering secrets. The forest was silent, but it was the kind of silence that made you glance over your shoulder. The snow underfoot no longer seemed white, it looked grayish, almost dirty, under the flashlight's beam. As I neared the pond, I saw it, a dark figure standing on the ice. It was motionless, but its presence filled the air with a heavy, oppressive energy. I stopped, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Liam?" My words came out muffled, as if I were speaking through thick fabric. The figure turned its head toward me. Its face was illuminated faintly by the moonlight. It looked like Liam's face, but distorted, with dark, hollow voids where his eyes should have been. "You came back," he said. His voice was the same as the one on the phone. I didn't know how to respond. Words stuck in my throat, and my legs felt rooted to the ground. Liam took a step forward, and the ice beneath him cracked, but he didn't fall. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice growing hoarse, as if he were choking. I was scared," I whispered. The words came slowly, painfully, as if dragged out of me. "It was an accident. I didn't mean." "You left me, Kevin," he interrupted. "And now I will leave you." The figure took another step, and I saw something begin to emerge from the dark waters of the pond. Tendrils of ice, long and black, stretched toward me. They writhed and slithered, reaching for my feet. I froze, unable to move, unsure if I could even run. I stood frozen in terror. The black, sinewy tendrils of ice slithered toward my legs, carving deep cracks in the snow as they moved. They seemed alive, reaching out with deliberate intent to ensnare me. The flashlight in my trembling hand illuminated Liam's face, now even more grotesquely twisted, almost inhuman. "Liam, please," I begged, my voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. I panicked." Liam's figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. But instead of a response, I heard him laugh. It was a cold, sinister sound, echoing both nearby and from some distant void. "Sorry?" he rasped, his voice chilling and hollow. "Sorry that you left me to die. You didn't even try to save me." "That's not true," I shouted, though deep down I knew it was. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." "Scared?" he repeated, stepping forward. The ice beneath his feet groaned but did not break. Now you'll know what real fear is. The tendrils surged forward and coiled around my legs. I tried to pull away, but they held me fast, like icy shackles. A numbing cold swept through my body, as though frost itself had gripped every cell. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the snow, casting erratic, flickering shadows. "Liam, please!" I cried, struggling against the icy bonds. "I know I'm guilty. But give me a chance to make this right. Please!" The figure paused, standing at the edge of the pond. His face seemed more human now, but pain and anger were still etched into every feature. "You want redemption?" he asked, leaning closer. His glowing, hollow eyes bored into mine. "Then you must endure what I endured." The tendrils yanked me forward toward the pond. I screamed, clawing at the ground, but my hands slid across the wet, icy snow. The cold seeped deeper into my core, numbing my thoughts, clouding my will. "Liam!" I screamed, but he remained silent. As I reached the edge of the pond, the ice beneath me cracked ominously. The tendrils pulled me down, and I felt the frigid water envelop my legs. My body shook uncontrollably, and my breathing became ragged. The water dragged me further into its dark embrace. I clawed at the edges of the ice, but it shattered in my hands. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my bones, paralyzing my mind with its merciless grip. In the suffocating darkness, a voice emerged, not Liam's, but something else. It was deep, haunting. "You must endure this to uncover the truth." The water swallowed me whole, and the world around me disappeared. The icy water enveloped me completely, like thousands of needles piercing my skin. My heart pounded furiously, and my lungs burned from the lack of air. Everything was dark, and I couldn't find my way to the surface. Panic consumed my mind, but amidst the chaos, I suddenly saw him. Through the murky water, Liam's figure appeared. He looked calm, but his eyes were filled with sorrow. "Do you want the truth, Kevin?" His voice echoed in my mind, even though I couldn't breathe. I nodded, struggling to focus despite the suffocating fear. "You must see," he said, and scenes began to materialize around me. They were memories. I saw myself and Liam, our friends, moments of happiness. And then, that dreadful night. I saw myself leaving him, watched him struggle for his life in the icy water. It felt like an eternity, reliving that unbearable guilt. "Do you understand now?" Liam asked. "You took me away. But I don't want your death. I want you to live with this. To never forget." The water began to recede, and I felt myself being pushed upward. I broke through the surface, gasping for air. I was back by the pond, alone. Liam was gone, and the tendrils had melted into the icy snow. I lay there for a long time, shivering, my breath ragged, and my mind heavy with the weight of what I'd seen. I knew Liam was gone, but his words and the truth would remain with me forever. I lay on the ice at the edge of the pond, desperately gasping for air. The cold gripped my body, but oddly I felt lucky. I was alive. Yet along with that came the bitter truth. I had seen everything that happened last year. Now there was no escaping it, either from the memories nor from my guilt. The forest around me felt unnaturally silent, as if it too understood that something significant had ended. I stood up, my legs trembling, my hands still wet and frozen. The moonlight illuminated the pond, now peaceful, as though nothing had happened. But I knew its calm was deceptive. "Liam," I whispered, staring into the dark water. But he did not answer. I took a step back and stopped when I noticed something on the ice near my feet. It was the same photograph I had found in the yard. In it, Liam and I were smiling, happy, alive. But now, the photograph looked different. Liam's face was blurred, as if the water had washed away his features. I picked it up, my cold fingers clutching the damp paper. I couldn't tell if this was a sign. But deep down, I knew Liam had left it for me. I made my way back to the house, limping through the snow. When I reached the door, the light inside seemed too bright. I closed the door behind me, but I no longer felt safe. The house, once a refuge, now felt empty, cold, dead. The phone sat on the table. I stopped staring at it. It no longer rang, but its presence filled me with unease. As if it still had something to say. As if everything wasn't quite over. I stepped closer, slowly, cautiously. My hand trembled as I picked up the receiver. It was icy, just as it had been before. "Hello?" I asked, almost whispering. I didn't know why I spoke to it again. Perhaps I wanted closure, an ending to this story. At first, there was silence. I thought, for a moment, that the phone would remain quiet. But then I heard it. A faint whisper, hoarse, barely audible. "Live with it, Kevin. But remember, we will always be here." The line went dead. The phone didn't ring again. I set the receiver down and sank into the chair by the fireplace. The fire crackled, but it gave no warmth. In my hands was the photograph, and I stared at it, trying to make out the face that was no longer clear. I knew this was the end, but not the kind of end that brings peace. My life had changed. I had left Liam to die, and now I had to live with that. His voice, his image, those horrifying moments I had seen beneath the water, all of it would stay with me forever. The forest outside the window stood silent, but now I knew it was watching. The pond remained just as quiet, but within its depths lay a truth I would never escape. The phone didn't ring again, but I knew this wasn't truly the end.